All right, we are good to go. Welcome, hey everybody, welcome to another installment of Vantage Ventures Real Talks. My name is Isaac Obiama. Thank you so much for joining us today on this somewhat, rainy Wednesday, but we are not going to let the weather get us down today because we have an absolute powerhouse of a guest today. And we're looking forward to this conversation. I've been honestly looking forward to this conversation for well over a month since we were able to book her. I'm going to introduce our guest today, Dr. Patrice Harris, former president of the American Medical Association, the first Black woman to hold this position. She's also the CEO of eMed, which I'll let her get into a little bit later. And to make it even better, she is a native West Virginian and a WU alumni. So I know I'm just scratching the surface here about what makes her such an impressive person and the perfect guest for us to have on today. But I'd like to give a second to introduce Dr. Harris, ladies and gentlemen. I'll give you the round of applause, the virtual round of applause.
Thank you, Isaac. It's certainly my pleasure to be here with you today. And it is raining a little bit in Atlanta as well. A storm blew over, but yes, we're still engaged and having this great conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Glad the weather didn't cut us off. That's good.
That's right.
So I obviously gave like the briefest blurb possible, but I was hoping maybe you could kick us off by giving us a little bit into your background, kind of showing us your story a little bit.
Absolutely. So born and raised in Bluefield, West Virginia, all the way at the bottom of our great state. Again, came to WVU for undergrad, fell in love with WVU actually as a young girl. We had a football hero from our town from Bluefield years ago, Dwayne Woods, actually from Bluefield. And so we used to drive up, my family used to drive up on Saturdays, and I just remember this wonderful, beautiful fall Saturday at Old Mountaineer Field, and just had a great time and fell in love with WVU, and so decided early on that that's where I wanted to come to pursue my career. Wanted to be a physician since I was in the 8th grade, and my inspiration was a TV doctor, right? That again, I think all the younger folks in the virtual room will have to Google, but it's Marcus Welby, MD, TV doctor. But what I liked about Dr. Welby was he not only took care of his patients' medical needs right inside the exam room, but he also cared about their families and the broader community, and that appealed to me. And again, was the reason that I wanted to be a physician. Have always had a passion for working with children and had planned to be a pediatrician. But my 3rd year medical school, which by the way, I completed my last 2 years of medical school at CAMC, Charleston, wanted to be closer to my parents those last couple of years. And on my psychiatry rotation during my 3rd year, I had a patient, very interesting patient, was ill, but just very interesting. And he was delusional. He thought he was Axl Rose. And it just made me even more fascinated with the brain. And I then decided that I could sort of integrate my passion for working with children with this new passion for psychiatry and do child and adolescent psychiatry. So after graduating from West Virginia, I came down to Atlanta to finish my residency and fellowship training at the Emory University School of Medicine, and then continued my passion and commitment to changing from within, and my passion for, if you see a problem, and I really, as I looked at the website, I love your point about being committed to being a relentless problem solver. That's been me, and I've always thought that, for me, each person has to make this decision, but you solve problems from within. And so I, again, worked my way up through what we call organized medicine, through the AMA. And after 25 years of hard work and a lot of team building with a lot of other physicians across this country, I was elected as president of the AMA. And of course, as you introduced me, I am now immediate past president, but had the privilege, but great responsibility of being president during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So certainly it has been a consequential year. And but I am so glad that I was in that space, the space of being the president of the AMA at that time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to have to dive into a lot of these different things. But what I'm interested to hear a little bit more about is, you being the CEO of eMed. We were talking a little bit before we got on here. You love that intersection between technology and healthcare. Maybe tell us a little bit about your experiences there.
Absolutely. Well, certainly over the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of interest in innovation and technology when it comes to healthcare. But I think if we're honest, some of those pieces of innovation and new technology actually did not add to physicians and others' ability to care for patients, and in worst case scenario, detracted from that.
Mhm.
And so again, my commitment to solving problems and solving problems from within. And actually, we looked at this from the American Medical Association from an organizational perspective, but again, having this individual commitment to, all right, here's what we need to do. We need to partner with these entrepreneurs who are developing new technology, right? Certainly, the voice of the physician and really others in the healthcare ecosystem need to be present at the beginning, right, of the process, not at the end. And so we made a commitment as an organization to partner with entrepreneurs and those who are innovating at the beginning of the process. Again, so you can have that knowledge and make sure that whatever you are inventing or thinking about, again, adds to our ability to take care of patients. And so taking that on as an individual, I was approached by a startup company, eMed, in the middle of the pandemic, who, again, we want to solve bigger problems after COVID, but right now wanted to focus on issues around access to testing, right? Because I think we all saw at the beginning of the pandemic the long lines, the days wait, several days wait for results. And
Mhm.
by the way, oftentimes these testing sites were not in the hardest hit communities. We know that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted communities of color.
Absolutely.
And so those testing sites were not in those communities more often than not. You had to drive. Not everyone has a car.
Mhm.
And so, again, the folks at eMed, engineers, funders, tech specialists, tech professionals said, let's get together and solve this problem. Again, sometimes folks just like to invent things for the sake of inventing things. Present company accepted, and I know that is not what Advantage Ventures is about. But we actually were, looked at a problem and wanted to solve a problem, and so I was approached to be the CEO of eMed, and we partnered again with Abbott to bring testing for COVID-19 into the home, but testing that is credentialed and verified. So this is new for me, but again, it matches my commitment to being a part of the solution. And I'm very excited about our work thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm curious to know is there anything that really surprised you about, the technical side of that? Were there any like big challenges that you came into contact with that you had to overcome?
Well, here's what I think smart people do. They are clear, they are self aware and clear about their strengths.
Mhm.
And so, the one thing that I can recognize though is talent, and we have very talented tech folks, and I just let them go. I mean, I am there and saying, look, let me tell you how it works on the ground as a physician, seeing our patients or whatever pain points there are, right? And I've been able to see those individually in my own practice, but organizationally across the entire spectrum of medicine, all specialties. And so I can share my knowledge. Here are the pain points. Here are the problems that we need you to solve. Here are areas where you can really add to, again, our ability to give the best care for our patients, with the patient and the family being at the center of this work.
Yeah.
Here are ways that you can make sure that you don't worsen existing health inequities. Again, we've seen that with COVID, but
Mhm.
these health inequities existed pre-COVID. And I think probably everyone on this audience has seen some early um, warning signs or early examples of how technology can worsen, right? Uh,
Mhm.
Health inequities, looking at algorithms. But again, if the people who are developing the algorithms don't have the information, maybe don't have a diversity of thought and opinion and race and ethnicity, those existing implicit biases will just be transferred over to the technology, right? And you're getting an MBA and so that's where I come in and just elevate all of these issues around health inequities. And again, make sure that we get to the solution that I think everyone wants,
Mhm.
that we want to improve health outcomes and we don't want to worsen already existing issues or and particularly health inequities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been something that has really surprised me over the past couple of years as I've gotten an MBA. Is, as I've progressed through my career, is that how inequities can creep into technology and have these large impacts that we don't tend to think about all the time. And so that's something to definitely think about. I'd like to maybe go back a little bit and talk about your experiences growing up in West Virginia, and specifically if you know were there any experiences through living in West Virginia, being a West Virginian, that helped you kind of transition from, your from private practice to, the entrepreneurial side of things, to leading the American Medical Association, which we could argue is, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the most important institutions we have.
Well, I would say, solid foundations are key. And
Mhm.
I clearly had a solid foundation growing up again in Bluefield, the very large, close-knit, extended family who always supported me, who never questioned my ability to become a physician. Now, clearly, I did not have ambitions at that time to be president of the American Medical Association. Clearly, growing up, I probably didn't even know what the American Medical Association was
Right.
because, no one in my immediate family or family friends were physicians. But I think it's always good to have a solid foundation, folks who believe in you no matter what. And clearly, and let me just say, I sort of gave, the synopsis of my journey.
Mhm.
But I always make this point, and I appreciate the question. It was not a straight line journey. It was full of detours and challenges and setbacks as well as successes. But you know what? That I imagine describes most of our lives, right?
Oh yeah.
Very rarely do we have a journey where we don't fail,
Mhm.
right? Or where we don't have challenges. And I think that's important. So, throughout my childhood, again, having that foundation of support and confidence building early on, which you need, because there are times when people told me that I couldn't be a physician, that I wasn't smart enough, or maybe because I was confused about the path to get there. Because again, I always tease, and this will also show my age, but when I, was accepted into WVU, sent a paper catalog. It's almost like a newspaper, and I
Yeah.
had to figure out what to major in, and I had no idea what to major in if you want to become a physician. And I pouring through the catalog, I saw medical technology, and I that was the only major that had medical in the words. And so I said, "Oh, this must be what you major in if you want to become a physician." It wasn't. Those are the folks, the very bright, talented folks who do the lab work and peer into microscopes, although much fancier now than back then. And I think at times as I look back, perhaps people confuse my lack of knowledge about the process with a lack of commitment. And so, again, throughout the course of my 10 years, been, well, do you really, are you smart enough? Is this really what you want to be? Maybe perhaps you don't want to be. And so again, but here I am today, having negotiated through all of those detours and challenges and setbacks. And I think those were all learning moments for me
Mhm.
because we are not who we are on the worst day of our lives, and we are also not who we are on the best day of our lives. I mean, it's the integration of all of who we are throughout our lives. And so I think that foundation and just learning moments from my time at West Virginia held me in great stead through the challenges of this past year.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess transitioning from, that foundation that you're talking about to the vision of the future. What was your personal vision when working with the American Medical Association with your time as president, and how is that translated into the work that you still do today?
Well, the president of the American Medical Association is the spokesperson for the organization, and we have a good strategic plan, right? And we have strategic priorities, overarching priorities, improving health outcomes,
Mhm.
sort of eliminating those pain points that I talked before, regulatory burden, and we call it restoring sort of the joy in medicine is one way we look at that, because there's so much administrative and regulatory burden, and sort of just eliminating the barriers and the pain points in physicians' lives. And then the third is accelerating what we call accelerating change in medical education. Sort of, certainly how we train the next generation of physicians should be different than even how I was trained. We should always be evolving, and so we sort of highlighted that. So those were the AMA strategic priorities. Of course, as president, I amplified those.
Mhm.
But personally, and I said this on the night of my inauguration, which, by the way, was attended by so many folks from WVU. President Gee was there because what was important to me that night, and that's always been very important to me, is bringing all of who I am into the position.
Mhm.
And so I talked about my West Virginia background, my Georgia. I live in Atlanta now, my psychiatry, mental health background, my being an African American woman. And so I brought all of who I was, a member of my sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And by the way, congratulations. WVU student body president Maya is a member of my sorority, and so congratulations on being a first and breaking that barrier. So I brought all of who I was, and the three things I said I wanted to amplify, in addition to the AMA strategic priorities, was number one, to make sure that folks appreciate the importance of mental health care
Mhm.
as a critical piece, not as a set aside or a separate piece into overall healthcare. The second was making sure that we were addressing issues around diversity in the physician workforce.
Mhm.
Not a very diverse workforce at this point in time. And by the way, not just as a checkbox, right? Not
Sure.
just counting numbers, but in the service of equity, right? You have a more diverse workforce that gets you to equity,
Mhm.
health equity. And by the way, I think you can look at articles and studies, Harvard Business Review and others that clearly show that a diverse organization is a higher performing and higher functioning organization. So it really is in the spirit of, making sure healthcare has better outcomes. And the third is elevating the importance of trauma, and
Mhm.
particularly childhood trauma. So those are my three areas of focus that I mentioned on the night I was inaugurated. And by the way, of course, no one would have wished this pandemic on our world. But during this pandemic, right, all three of those issues have been amplified. The importance of mental health. We've seen a lot of increased, very important conversation about mental health, and we can talk more about that and what we've seen during this pandemic, and my thoughts, post the acute phase of this pandemic. Certainly, health inequities have been elevated.
Mhm.
Exposed, if you will, not new, but exposed. And lastly, trauma. And
Mhm.
if you think about the trauma of that some in our community experience more than others in encounters with law enforcement, but just the trauma that folks are exposed to regarding the losses. Some people have actually lost family members, but the disruption. And listen, and I, I've heard President Gee talk about this, and happy to hear from you, not to put you on the spot, but clearly, students, from our youngest students to our students at the university level, your education has been impacted. Again, as we even think about medical school, we have the first class who are spending or have spent an entire year with mostly virtual learning.
Sure.
So clearly, the issues that I wanted to amplify have been even further amplified during this pandemic.
No, absolutely. And speaking to that, that education question that you kind of brought up, I think that it's been such a different experience depending on what college you fall into and what type of education you're trying to pursue. I think the MBA program has done a great job of pivoting and kind of adapting to these challenges. But I can certainly acknowledge that maybe for other people that needed to be in labs at the beginning of the pandemic or those types of experiences, they may have a very different experience than myself. There were two things that you brought up there that we're probably going to have to hit both of them, but specifically looking at the diversity side of what you were talking about. This is a question that kind of hits home for me as well. My dad is a practicing anesthesiologist, and so being a doctor and a person of color, have you seen a lot of strides in for women of color or just generally people of color in the medical field? And do you feel like they're recognized at the same level for the success that their peers would be?
Certainly, we've seen some progress when it comes to African American women, and actually women, let's just say women in general, because a little over 50%, this may, change year to year, but a little over 50% of medical school classes are composed of women. But certainly when it comes to women from communities of color, underrepresented group, not enough progress, maybe inching, very small. I have to say, though, when it comes to Black men in medicine, we should all be alarmed here because we have gone backwards. So we've not even made a tiny bit of progress. And there's a recent documentary, Black Men in White Coats. And so this is truly alarming. And something that we all need to pay attention to. But we've made some progress, but we still have a long way to go. And certainly as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and as we think about structural determinants of health and structural racism and implicit bias and discrimination, and then we think about the social determinants of health, housing, transportation, education.
Yeah.
Education is related to health, one's health opportunities and health outcomes. And for that reason, and for a lot of reasons, I believe and I'm committed to making sure that we are starting early. Folks talk about pipeline programs, critical. We should be starting in 3 to 6 year olds. We should be talking about the socio-emotional development and health of our youngest. We should be talking about preschool. You heard me talk about foundations. Let me just connect that dot. That's when foundations are formed, right? Of healthy coping and trauma and just, foundation of learning. And that just starts folks on a potentially a good trajectory. There are opportunities for mischief and opportunities for a lot of other deterrents along the way. But I think we start as early as possible. And we have to be intentional about this work, right? When you talk about diversity and equity, it's not just going to happen. And let me say this while we're talking about this, and I know the audience probably knows this, but sometimes I like to just state things just for the sake of being explicit.
Sure.
We are not talking about racial quotas here, right? We are talking about equitable opportunities and making sure that, folks are prepared to exceed and have equitable opportunities to exceed. And so, and succeed, exceed expectations and succeed in school. Success in school, builds upon success. And there's no question to be an MBA. You just didn't wake up one day and say, I want to, dip an MBA, and it was suddenly there for you, right? A lot of hard work and preparation and support along the way. So we have to be intentional about this work. Those who are around decision-making tables today should always look around the room, around the table, to see who's missing, who's not being represented. And again, by the way, if you don't have the person to represent, that's okay. You can still represent the interests. People around the table can still make sure they are educated about the issue, right?
Absolutely.
And making sure they are doing what they can to make environments inclusive. Yeah. And so that's critical when you talk about diversity, by the way. And I do think we should talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a triple threat, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so kind of talking about, you were saying earlier, we need to start having these conversations with children at a very young age. I think you said 3 to 6 years old, talking about how crucial those early developmental years are for children. do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has, created some long-lasting mental health challenges for children? And if so, how do we as a society kind of overcome those?
Well, that is the worry. And so, I am not one to be hyperbolic and to say that disaster looms, but clearly we've seen an increase in anxiety,
Mhm.
in sad and sustained depressed moods. There are reports in some states have been reporting, and by the way, one message you probably heard me uh, say a lot during my year as president is we need to make sure we are always focusing on the science and the data.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, there's been an attack on science and data lately. And so all of us need to make sure that we are data informed and
Mhm.
evidence informed. But clearly, we need to make sure we get the data. But again, early reports are that there have been increases. Some states have been reporting increases in overdoses.
Wow.
Pre-pandemic, we've seen increase in suicidal thinking.
Mhm.
And by the way, in young Black boys, we've seen an increase in suicidal thinking over and above the percentage increases for other demographics.
Wow.
And so that is the worry. And by the way, pre-pandemic, I had seen in my own patient population, adolescents,
Mhm.
increase in anxiety, right? And there's a lot of bullying and cyberbullying and all of those things. So I've seen that certainly pre-pandemic and now. Pandemic is worsening that. Students are feeling lonely and isolated. So
Sure.
I am worried, and that's why again it's important to have these conversations, and we should be thinking now about problem solving, right? That's
Definitely.
what Vantage Ventures is about. And connecting another dot to an early piece of our conversation, I
Mhm.
hope entrepreneurs and those who are thinking about technology to solve these issues, there is a role.
Mhm.
Now we have to make sure that that technology is informed, right, by good clinical practice and sound practices. It would not be my recommendation. Can't prevent anyone from doing this, but it would not be my recommendation that folks are just inventing and developing and doing problem solving in isolation, right?
Yeah.
Context with partners who appreciate the healthcare ecosystem.
Yeah.
We need that. We need folks to think about that and how we can improve access to mental health
Yeah.
uh, as we move forward.
Definitely. And would you say, and I'm kind of figuring out how to formulate the question, but um, you talked about seeing this increase in anxiety and suicidal thinking in young black men or young black kids. Um, has the current political climate contributed to that in any way?
It's hard to know, and again, we want to. Y- y- I definitely wouldn't draw that
Sure.
distinction with the political climate, but clearly context is important, right? I gave a TED style talk once, and I said, really, if we want to solve any public health challenge, we need data
Hmm.
and we need context and we need to be intellectually honest, or another way of saying it, to be about the business of telling the truth, right? Truth telling. And so I think we can all say that in the context of what's going on, social media, again, this is pre-pandemic. I
Sure.
talk a lot to my adolescents. It's tough. I did not have to grow up with the potential that every mistake that I made
Hmm.
as a youngster
Hmm.
is on social media, right?
Sure.
That my classmates know about it, and maybe I don't want to sound ancient, but as I was growing, yeah, my classmates might know about it, but it wasn't on broader social media, maybe just a few of my classmates. So there's an environment of that. Our political discourse has also, and it's been very, we should have fair-minded debates about policy.
Hmm.
That is great. I mean, I'm a little bit of a democracy nerd.
Hmm.
I almost, I guess geek out on democracy. We've
Yeah.
seen actually, candidly, democracy challenged,
Mm.
and so a fair-minded debate about policy, disagreement, diversity of thought and opinion absolutely okay.
Mhm.
But when we can't even talk to one another, when things like compromise it is a dirty word, I think we're in trouble. And so I think I can tell you, let me just share individually,
Mhm.
last year and a half, and the political discourse has made me feel unsafe. So I'll just share that as an individual. It's made me feel less safe. I would say not unsafe, but less safe.
Mhm.
And so I would imagine that there are a lot of folks who felt less safe, with our political discourse as it has evolved over the last several years.
Mhm. No question. Yeah, I'd like to take a second we have some audience questions coming in. So let me just check and see what we have here. Here we go. All right. So it says the RNI here at WU has tested the use of deep brain stimulation technology. This is a deep question, I guess. Deep brain stimulation technology to treat opioid addiction. What other kinds of emerging technologies like this are also being used in public health treatment?
So I'm very excited about that work. For those in the audience who don't know, I have chaired the AMA's opioid task force
Mhm.
since its inception in 2014. And certainly, when you think about bringing all of me into everything that I do, of course, I did that in my role as a leader of the American Medical Association. But of course, it did not escape me uh, uh, that West Virginia was a state that was hard hit by the opioid epidemic. So that made me even more passionate about this work. And so I'm so excited about that work at the RNI. And I know a little bit about that work and have been engaged there with Dr. Asai. But and I know I actually folks talk about apps, predictive analytics. I know folks are working on predictive analytics. And so, looking at text and other things, can we help folks who are using? And we know that over the last year, we have not had the traditional ways to support folks who either want treatment or were in the middle of treatment. And so I know folks have been looking at applications and have been looking at AI.
Mhm.
And by the way, I'm going to say AI. And at the AMA, we talk about augmented intelligence and not artificial intelligence
Mhm.
because we believe, and I think most people believe now, that it's about augmenting our human intelligence.
Mhm.
Now maybe, and I'm a Star Trek fan, I don't know, maybe 200 years from now, we won't crave that human connection. But I think actually this pandemic has demonstrated that at this point
Mhm.
in our lives and our society, we miss that human interaction. And I think there are a lot of young folks on the call may have had a learning moment there, and that the human connection is critical. Now, again, maybe 200 years from now, it may not be. But so I know there's some work going on with augmented intelligence issues, or looking at applications and technology. So a lot of folks are looking at this. I mean, there's some exciting things about and this is um, less innovation, but new ways of delivering drugs and looking at pain. Because as we think about opioids, we also have to think about pain and making sure that patients in pain have what they need. And so there are all kinds of work and research going on regarding the best way to treat patients who are in pain.
Sure.
So anyway, lots of exciting work, and so proud of what's going on right there at WVU.
Oh yeah, no, and I can say personally, as a young person, I do miss that the personal connection. So I don't see any situation for me in the coming year where I want to like not have that. But this next question comes from Sarah Biller actually, where she says, appreciate the interdisciplinary entrepreneurial approach eMD is taking to testing in the home. How can we make sure underserved communities benefit from this advancement in managing one's own health?
And I'm so excited about that, and I am so excited about that opportunity. And that's one of the things we are uh, looking at eMed, because it's very easy, and we have to be intentional, right? You have to look at the needs of different communities. There are no one size fits all approaches, right? And so you have to make sure that the approach can be used. Now, you might not, be able to meet every population with every innovation, but you have to be intentional about, communities will be able to use particular technology. And I will just say, because, from a broader policy standpoint, one of the things that's been clear, and COVID has unmasked, we knew this already, but not everyone had access to broadband. Right. So even if you look at something like a telehealth, right, which we had to go to, I was already using telehealth in my practice, but we had to go to more, especially at the very beginning when we really needed to shelter in place. But that left people out, as you know, Sarah. Some of the very folks who needed it the most didn't have broadband, couldn't afford a data plan. Perhaps there was only one device in the home. And so it's being intentional about that. We did research at eMed and learn that if you look at across the economic spectrum and looked at who had one device versus two, and so you want to make sure your technology matches, what people have in the community right now, while also thinking through policy, making sure, and as we think about infrastructure, certainly making sure everyone has access to broadband should be the key. And we saw that not only with health, but with education, right? We saw the school buses in rural areas also. So it was urban areas, but sometimes rural areas. To go to school buses were sites, they had the connection, the internet connection for Wi-Fi connections on school buses. So they had to drive there. So it's about, Sarah, being intentional. And at the very beginning, when you're problem solving, ask the question, what are we doing here? How are we making sure that everyone has access to this? And once you do that, and once you are proactive about that at the very beginning of the relentless problem solving, then that informs the work throughout, the rest of the product development, if you will. And it's too late if you get to the end. And to me, and you guys are
Sure.
better at this than I am, but I understand, that because then, oh no, we forgot to think about rural, we forgot to think about communities of color. Then you're retrofitting, right?
Hmm.
And so if you think about and incorporate these concepts at the very beginning of the development of the technology, you will be able to problem solve and make sure you're not worsening those inequities.
Absolutely. It needs to be a factor of the discussion from the beginning.
From the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And so being conscious of your time, we have one more question. This just asks about, your personal hopes and what's coming next for you.
Well, I'm very excited about this eMed venture, and excited about the future, and really problem solving and looking to increase access to care, to testing, to diagnostics, particularly around what could be, what the future could be for mental health. People ask me if I'm optimistic. I mean, I laid out at the very beginning of our talk today a lot of issues. There are a lot of things on our to-do list, and it could. And by the way, I have my moments where, okay, are we going to be able to figure this out? This is a lot, and it's overwhelming. But I'm optimistic because I think that during this pandemic, for a lot of these issues, more people saw them, right? In our day-to-day lives, there's a lot of distractions. But during COVID, many of those distractions were removed. And so a lot more people know, and I think really truly understand these issues, and are really committed to some problem solving. And so I'm pragmatically optimistic.
Yeah.
But that means that we will have to make sure that we are continuing these conversations, and making sure that we are having these conversations at the beginning of our work, and not at the end. And the last thing I will say is I am optimistic because I do believe I see more folks who are committed to learning, committed to coming to the table, having done some homework, right? You didn't get to be where you are, and I didn't get to be where I am, and most of the folks in the audience didn't get to be where we are without doing some homework. And so there's homework to be done on mental health and innovation. and technology. And by the way, I do want to bring this in because I'm so excited about what's happening at West Virginia, and I am excited about telling another story about West Virginia. I know that I am invested in property in Bluefield. I think there's so many opportunities for entrepreneurship and small business develop. There's an untold story in particularly Southern West Virginia, but there's an untold story about African Americans in West Virginia.
Mhm.
And in fact, the first years of my life, my parents had an apartment in a hotel that is listed on the Green Book. And I won't go into details. I have folks do a little bit of education about the Green Book.
Sure.
And so I'm so excited about opportunities for our state and investment and entrepreneurship and telling the full story because we don't always hear the full story about Appalachia, particularly Blacks in Appalachia. Both my grandfathers worked in the coal mines, my dad worked on the railroad. So I am interested in telling that story, and I'm very excited about entrepreneurship and innovation and technology as we tell the full story of West Virginia.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can't think of a better note to end that on, being pragmatically optimistic. No question about it. Well, thank you, Dr. Harris, so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Is there any place that people can find you on social media, websites, that type of thing?
At Patrice Harris, MD.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again for taking the time. For those of you that want more information, you can check out our website at vantageventures.com. Have a good one.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.